First of all, I'm Jeff, and I'm from Calvary Audio, and I help Calvary chapels around the country set up their sound systems and train volunteers to help run the boards. So a lot of times I encounter systems that have been installed and there's never been any real official training done. They just kind of get dropped with the stuff, and so there's a lot of interesting stories there of how people manage to figure things out. And it all works for good usually, but a lot of times with a little bit of training they can fully utilize the system capability and be able to then get a little more quality sound for the fellowship. So I think what we're going to do first of all is just take a look at the mixing board that's on site here. And we spent the last couple of days kind of figuring out what would work best for the use here, and then relabeling the board and rewiring some of the things on stage so that it all makes sense. And I really think that a big part of setting up a system is labeling it, so somebody who's not necessarily familiar with the system, or maybe not too in-depth trained on the particular system, or maybe somebody that has very little experience at all, can be able to come in and turn the system on and at least get a microphone to work without having to touch all 800 knobs to figure out how to make that happen. So if we want to just start on a channel here and go through one channel, once you learn one channel, the others are very similar. There's also a master section that once you learn that, again, one section is usually repeated a multiple number of times. So if you just take it a piece at a time like that and break it down, it's not so terribly complicated. And it gets to be a lot more fun to operate when you know what you just did actually did something, instead of many knobs they don't appear to do anything at all. And sometimes that's the case too, is what not to turn and what doesn't work is as important to know as what to do. So we're going to go first of all to a channel here, and I'm just going to pick channel 17 as an example. At the very top of the channel there is a knob called gain control. And gain control is not to be used as a volume control. Often I'll see setups where the faders are set at 0, and somebody around the country is training people to run the gains here as the volume controls, which doesn't work too well for the monitor systems or the in-ear systems that the worship team has on stage, because when you adjust this control, you're of course adjusting all the gain structure for that channel and changing everybody's level, including the recording level and all the monitor levels, not just the level that's coming out in the main speakers. So the proper way to set gain control is with the knob up here and the pre-fade listen button down on top of the channel. And what that allows you to do then is use the meters to visually set at around 0. Your target typically is going to be around 0 or around +3 you can go up to. You don't want to go up into the red ever with any signal source. Even though red may not be distortion, it's getting real close to approaching the distortion level. And once you get to distortion, then it all just sounds loud and not very clear. So you want to keep things clean and keep it around 0, +3 is good. So you'll do that with a signal source and adjust the gain control to just keep those meters around 0. You also should know that when you set up and do a tape deck or a DVD, those signals have been processed and limited so that 0 stays pretty much 0. It's been normalized in that way. When you have a live worship team, I've discovered that they turn up about 3 dB. They get about twice as loud from rehearsal to the actual worship time. So you may want to back your gains down a little bit during rehearsal, just so you have that additional headroom and not be forced to then go adjusting all your gains down at the beginning of the first song. So you get the gain set, PFL button. You can visually see it here. PFL also allows you to listen to that channel in the headphones. So you can hear the level in the headphones and you can kind of judge whether it's distorted or not, but the visual part of using the meters really helps you set that gain structure on the channel. And then we'll just go down the channel. The next section on this board is the equalization. And equalization is important. You're correcting not so much the speaker system or the amplifier tone. That should be set up by the installer so that the speakers are fairly flat in the room, or they sound the way you want them to. What you're doing with the channel EQ then is for different microphones or different instrument inputs, many acoustic guitars, many different pickups. I mean, they all have different characteristics. So you're going to want to have something that's pleasant. Doesn't necessarily mean everything has to sound exactly the same tone-wise, but you're going to want to be able to make it sound blend with the other instruments or the other voices. And you can do that using the tone controls on each channel. So much like a home stereo or car stereo, you've got your basic highs, mids, and lows. So highs are highs, mids are the mid-range, and lows would be the bass. But you also have the ability on this board to not only boost and cut mids, but you can choose what frequency you want. And I've also had experience with people that aren't familiar with this concept, that they just think that there's 5 or 6 EQ knobs here. Well, actually, there aren't 5 or 6 EQs. There's 4 EQs, booster cuts, and those are in the darker green knobs. And then the lighter green knobs are a sweep knob that lets you select what frequency you're boosting and cutting at. So if I had a graph, a whiteboard, I'd show you here, but essentially what you're doing is you're either boosting or cutting, and then that sweep allows you to go either up or down on the frequency scale. So it gives you a lot of flexibility if you have just a MIDI sound that you can't quite get rid of, I mean mid-range by saying MIDI. You can tune that mid-range and just either boost or cut it and take out that portion of it without affecting the rest of the frequency spectrum. And again, you're using this to really tune the microphone or the instrument to the room. You're not trying to fix the room sound with this EQ. There's an EQ on-off switch. You can turn that on and off to kind of compare what it would sound like without any EQ, and then you can punch it in and out to go back and forth for an A-B comparison. There is one thing you should know about gain and EQ, particularly in the low ranges. When you start boosting these, it is going to change the gain characteristics of the channel. So if you have an instrument like bass guitar or bass drum, I find myself boosting sometimes the low end just to emphasize that, then you're going to want to do some of your EQing or keep that in mind while you're setting your EQ, or you're going to have to go back and reduce the gain a little bit when you boost up those lower frequencies. Even at this low voltage level, just like in sound systems, the bass takes more power. You're pumping more voltage through this circuit, so your gain's going to have to be adjusted accordingly. Before we move on past the EQ, I'm going to go back up to the gain structure. Speaking of overpowering items that you may plug in, there is a button here that's a pad that essentially lets you add an additional reduction in what sort of input level that this channel will accept. So there's a dB pad here that, let's say you've got the output of a very high level output of a keyboard or something that's got a preamp already in it. Some guitar players have their guitar preamp and then a DI box with another preamp, or they got a rack full of effects and preamps. I don't know exactly what they do, and I don't know what they do either, but if it's too hot, you can push that pad down and then be able to manage the rest of the EQ. There is a peak light at the top of the channel that will visually help you see if that channel is being overdriven. That peak light will come on, that's a red LED, to just alert you that something's not right. Even though you may kind of hear it in the mix, sometimes it's hard to identify each channel individually, but that peak light will then catch your eye and you can go up here and change the gain or figure out what's going on. Right below the gain knob there is a button that is a high-pass filter that allows you to, it's not a high-pass filter, I'm sorry, that's a phase switch. It's a 0 with a line through it, a diagonal line. And that is in fact a phase switch. Essentially what you're doing is you're taking the microphone and you're putting it out of phase. You may hear something that sounds funny and the mic cord may be wired backwards, or somebody may have a cable that's been wired backwards. I haven't used too much in worship situations, but there's a technique for miking drums where the top mic on the snare is in phase and the bottom mic is out of phase, so everything's moving in the same direction and you don't get a cancellation effect. But for the most part, you're going to leave this in phase, which is in the up position. And right below that is, in fact, the high-pass filter. So before you get into equalization that you can adjust, the high-pass filter simply takes at a certain point, probably 100 cycles or so, and does a roll-off like this. And it acts as a rumble filter, is what they used to call it in hi-fi days, is that if you've got a bunch of mics on stage, sitting on the stage, and people are stomping on the stage, voice typically doesn't need much frequency reinforcement below 100 cycles. So you can use that high-pass filter to just cut off all that low-end garbage before it gets into the sound system, and it saves power, headroom in the amplifiers, and just general rumble in the room. So we'll come down the channel now. The next section we're going to talk about are the aux sends. And this board and some other boards have flexible assignment for the auxiliary sends. Big monitoring consoles are common in being able to assign either to a group or to a direct out, so you can have multiple monitor mixes on stage. So on this Yamaha board, and the way we've set it up is that the first 4 controls, which are M1 through 4, we're going to utilize over here the feature that allows you to select those to be fixed rather than variable. And all that means is that in the fixed position, M1 is now going to be assigned as group 1, and group 2, group 3, group 4 down the line. Those then go down to the master section to a subgroup area that I can control all of the channels that are assigned to group 1 with one fader here. So it makes it a lot easier if I have multiple microphones that I want to control with one fader. Instead of trying to go over here and use both hands and turn down all the drum mics at once, I can just do that with one fader here instead of having to go over and do all of the individual ones. So what we're going to do here is set this up with the vocals on a subgroup, and just as a way to set it up so that it becomes consistent, there's a male vocal subgroup, the guys, and a subgroup for the girls. There's a subgroup for instruments and a subgroup for drums. Now, typically, setting the board up, we're going to set our subgroup levels at 0. And we can always go back there and make adjustments if we need to on the fly. But at least to start out, we're going to set the subs at 0, come up here to our group mix, and because we've assigned this to a fixed level, those are now non-adjustable. In other words, this volume control is not engaged. If I try and turn it, nothing's going to happen. But I do have to select this, M1, to go to group 1. So M1, there's a button right down here that I select. So now I've selected on channel 17 that is going to be sent to group 1. Now I control the output of 17 with this or this as a master, and I could assign any number of channels to that group 1. And I'll interject here right now is that there would be no particular advantage to assigning a single channel to multiple groups unless you were doing stereo, in which case you could do left on group 1, right on group 2, then you have another left right here on 3 and 4. We're not going to do that in this particular situation. We're using these as mono sends going through the PA system. So subgroups, I'm selected on fixed. I assign by pushing down the button right next to the knob, and the knob is not functional. So that's the subgroups. And as I've indicated, the reason to use subgroups is so you can assign groups of channels that are similar, vocal mics, instrument mics, drum mics, and be able to control those with one group knob rather than having to fly all over the place and finding your individual levels. Before I go down to the monitors, I'm going to talk about sends other than the group sends, which are stereo sends. Down on the channel, there's a button that says ST. ST stands for stereo. And that allows this output to be directed to the house, the main output not going through any of the subgroups. And here again, you probably would never have a reason to send stereo and a group output. You're adding gain on top of gain, and you're doing some goofy signal flow stuff if you do it that way. Typically, if you do a stereo out, it's going to be your tape deck, CD player, playback, the line from the computer or the DVD outputs. Those are all stereo. You don't need to go through a group for any reason. So those go directly to the master output. And I also suggest that the main teaching mics or the main speaking podium mics be assigned directly to the stereo outputs. That gives you the ability on many boards to be able then on the groups, after worship is finished, you can come through and actually just kill the levels on those subgroups, or in the case of this board, there is a button that is assigned to stereo that you can disengage. So at least from the standpoint of sending those microphone channels to the main output, you've now essentially muted all of your instrument mics and everything that's not essential to the announcing or teaching, or if you're playing a source like a DV or tape background, so all your mics are killed coming out front. They're not muted as far as the stage monitors go. You'd have to actually go to each channel and mute or turn off those channels. But at least that gives you a quick way of turning off in the house all those open mics. And as I've said to some of the people here, at the end of worship, there's no shorter time period than the end of the song and when the guitar player unplugs his cord. All right, stereo, group. Group goes to master output by assigning it to stereo, just like you do on a channel. Stereo goes direct out, to stereo goes to direct out. And now we'll go down the channel to the monitor sends. And again, on this board, since this is geared particularly for this board, these monitor sends are what you typically would be sending to the floor monitors or in-ear monitors on stage. So we've decided that 4 sends is what we'd like to have available. You don't have to use all 4 sends, you can use 1. And it's nice to have a couple of speakers on stage to just have general fill for either vocalists or kids if they get up and do something, to have speakers to listen along the tracks with and not have to mess with in-ear monitors or any other speakers on sticks or anything like that. So it's good to leave at least a couple of speakers available on stage, and we've decided that monitor 4 is going to be that output to feed the speakers. Monitors 1, 2, and 3 are available both as speakers or as in-ear monitor systems, and that's done through patching in some of they're called the tie inputs back here in the rack, so that we actually are sending a line level up to stage to the floor pockets, as well as line level is going to the amplifiers, so that there is an option of either using an in-ear monitor system on stage that you can plug directly into a pocket, or if it's more appropriate to use a speaker, there is a speaker jack that you can plug in, and that still is active. So the reason you want to have multiple monitor mixes is everybody kind of wants to hear what they want to hear, and it's usually more of themselves than of the person standing right next to them. So individual mixes give you that ability to turn up a channel in monitor 1 but not in monitor 2. So you're able to mix actually a separate complete mix to go to each one of these monitor sends. There's a button next to the monitor send that's very important to note, and that is it's labeled pre. That lets you select whether these 2 knobs are going to be in the pre or post position, and that's referring to the pre or post fader position. If I want this monitor 1 and 2 to be independent of my gain changes here on each channel, then I'm going to want to have this selected in the pre position, and it just means that it is getting its signal pre-fader. In the post position, this level of monitor 1 and 2 is now going to track with this. And what you'll find is that most people don't like it when you change their levels in their monitors, whether they're floor or in-ear systems, Once you got it set at rehearsal or it's set from the previous worship session, you're going to want to pretty much leave it. So that pre-position gives you the ability to mix out here and get the things where you want it because you're out here. And then up on stage, they'll either live with what they have or they'll tell you what they need. Sometimes you have to ask so that you don't find out after worship rehearsal is done. I wish I had something in my monitors. So it's always a good idea to be part of the worship rehearsal and actually ask questions, make sure everything's okay, that they have what they need. In-ears are getting to be more popular because it reduces the stage level. To some extent, systems are available now that you have your own control on stage. You can mix your own mix, or you can at least mix a couple of different things, your instrument, your voice, and a send from one of these auxiliaries in your own ear monitors, so you can let the engineer out front pretty much just engineer out front and you can handle your own stuff on stage. There's 4 sends, 4 mixes. We go down to the next 2 knobs, and what I like to do is leave 2 knobs available for the effects send. Now we've got 1 effects unit currently in the system, so we're going to use monitor 10, the last knob here. And this I prefer to have in the post position so that this send going to the reverb is actually tracking along with your level control. That seems to work out the best. And it's also nice that if you turn this channel off, that the reverb send goes off and you don't just hear echo coming back in through the system without any of the dry system, any of the dry signal. Pan control is a different color, so it must do something else. And that's kind of the nice thing about the board, is it will by section be color coded so that at least of the 800 knobs or so that are on here, all the red ones do something, all the blue ones do something different, the gray ones, and so on. Pan control is, just as it would be in your hi-fi, a left to right control. Because the system has 2 outputs and the sound system in the room has 3 speakers, you may be wondering, well, how do I get center? And that would be, of course, another piece of equipment, a processor that does the signal flow from left, right, out, and it splits it to actually 3 positions. So that normally what you're going to want to do is run the pan control straight up and down. That also will allow this channel feeding left and right out to all the recording devices. They'll get even left and right. Any of the other zones like the patio or the cafe, you probably want to hear mono pretty much everywhere. Since it's not a theater environment, we're not trying to do Dolby Surround or anything too fancy that way. We're just trying to get fairly even sound to every seat in the house at a level that most people can tolerate. And some people can tolerate a lot, and some people can't tolerate hardly anything. I've had systems turned on but not actually operating yet, and people tell me it's too loud just because it looks like a lot of lights. So it's a kind of a listen with your eyes situation, and try and make as many people as you can happy, and then pray for the people you can't. On the channel is an on-off switch, and I've mentioned this a couple of times. That actually mutes this entire channel, including all the monitor sends. It doesn't matter where you have this volume control. If you hit the button and it comes up on this board, that's off, down is on. So if you have somebody talking and nothing seems to be coming out, this certainly would be a place to look to make sure that the channel is actually active and turned on, to make sure that if it's a stereo channel, you've selected stereo, and if it's a subgroup channel, that you've actually selected a subgroup. This is kind of a wrap up here. I'm going backwards. So channel selected, stereo, subgroup on, volume's up. You come over here, if a subgroup channel, you make sure your subgroups are up. Make sure the subgroups are assigned to the output. Make sure that the master level is turned up, and if all else fails, just make sure it's plugged in and on. I've actually had people call and say, it doesn't work. Is it plugged in? Oh, okay. So make sure, usually if the lights are on, that's a good sign. If the lights are off, it's probably not going to work. Let's talk about the group section a little bit more, and the monitor outputs. All of these faders